I was working the front desk at a hotel in Prague when an American guest walked up holding his phone like it personally offended him. He tapped the screen twice and said, "Your Wi-Fi doesn't work. I can't load anything." I glanced at his phone. Full bars, connected to our network. I asked what he was trying to open. "Everything," he said. "Instagram, Google, my banking app. Nothing loads." I asked if he had turned off airplane mode when he landed. Long pause. He looked at his phone, looked back at me, then quietly walked away without another word. His wife came down 20 minutes later to apologize. Another guest that same week asked me where she could exchange her dollars for European money. I told her Prague uses the Czech koruna, not euros. She stared at me like I just made that up. "But you're in Europe," she said. I explained that each country has its own currency. She genuinely looked confused and asked, "Even France?" This is the kind of global nuance I unpack in every episode. So if seeing the world through a sharper lens matters to you, subscribe. Yes, even France uses euros, not korunas. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she was still processing the idea that Europe wasn't one giant country with one type of money. Her co-worker in Amsterdam told me about a tourist who got genuinely upset that the Anne Frank house was just a regular old building and not more museum-like from the outside. He expected something grand. When she explained it was preserved to look like it did during the war, he said, "Well, that's not very welcoming for tourists." She didn't even know how to respond to that one. Then there was the guy in Rome who tried to pay for a cappuccino with a €50 note at 7 a.m. The barista told him he didn't have change yet. The guy got annoyed and said, "What do you mean you don't have change? You're a business." The barista just pointed at the clock. It was literally the first transaction of the day. The tourist huffed, left the 50 on the counter and said, "Keep the change," like he was doing them a favor. The cappuccino cost €1.20. I think the moment that stuck with me most was at a train station in Switzerland. An American woman missed her train and went to the ticket counter demanding they hold the next one for 5 minutes so she could get coffee. The agent very politely explained that trains run on a schedule. She said, "Okay, but I'm asking nicely." Like being polite would somehow stop the entire national rail system. It didn't. She missed that train too. These aren't isolated moments. They happen all the time. And the thing is, most of these tourists are lovely people. They're just genuinely surprised that the rest of the world doesn't work like home. So here are more stories that prove Americans don't always realize they're the tourists. I worked at a car rental place in Dublin for 2 summers. You would think renting a car is straightforward. It's not. Not when you forget which side of the road you're supposed to drive on. One guy picked up his car, confident as anything. He'd driven manual before, he said. No problem. 10 minutes later he came back, parked crooked across 2 spaces, and said the car was broken. I asked what was wrong. He said the gears wouldn't shift. I went out to check. He had been forcing the gear stick while the car was in motion without using the clutch. I asked if he knew how to drive a manual. He said yes. I asked him to show me. He turned the key, threw it into first, and tried to drive off without pressing the clutch. The car lurched forward and stalled. He looked at me and said, "See? Broken." I spent 15 minutes explaining the clutch. He swore he knew how to drive stick. Turned out, he'd only ever driven automatic his entire life and assumed a manual was basically the same. We swapped his car for an automatic. He left happy. I left exhausted. Another customer asked if we had cars with normal speedometers because she didn't understand kilometers. I explained that all our cars used metric. She asked if we could just put a sticker over it with miles per hour. I told her no. She rented the car anyway and got 3 speeding tickets in 2 days because she thought 100 meant 100 miles per hour. It means 100 kilometers. That's about 62 miles per hour. She was going 100 in a 50 zone. Twice. My friend worked at a train station in Paris. A tourist came up to him, pointed at the departure board and asked why all the times were wrong. My friend looked. The times were fine. The tourist insisted they were wrong because it says 14 hours, but it's only 2 p.m. My friend blinked, took a breath, and explained that 14 is 2 p.m. in 24-hour time. The tourist said, "Why would you do that?" My friend said, "Why wouldn't we?" Then there was the woman at the airport in Barcelona who got upset that her flight to Barcelona wasn't on the board. The agent asked her to repeat the city name. She said it again, Barcelona. The agent, very patiently, explained that it's pronounced Barcelona, with an S sound. The woman insisted the travel agent back home said, Barcelona. The agent pointed at the screen, Barcelona, with a C. She booked it anyway, but kept calling it Barcelona the whole time. I saw someone try to tip a bus driver in Germany. The driver looked so confused. The tourist held out a €5 note and said, "For your service." The driver just said, "I am paid to drive the bus." The tourist didn't know what to do with that. He eventually just pocketed the money and sat down. A guy asked me once if he needed a passport to take a train from Paris to London. I said yes. He seemed surprised. "But it's just a train," he said. I explained that it crosses borders. You go through customs. He thought trains were like buses. Just hop on and go. I told him the Eurostar literally goes under the ocean. He paused. "Wait, under?" "Yes, under the Channel Tunnel." He had no idea. Booked the trip anyway. Loved it. But genuinely had no clue he'd be underwater. I track these kinds of moments constantly, where assumptions collide with reality. So if long-term perspective is your thing, this channel's built for it. Another traveler asked if she needed to exchange money to go to Scotland. I said not if she had British pounds already. She asked, "So they use the same money as England?" I said yes. She looked relieved and said, "Oh, good. I thought Scotland was its own country." I paused, said, "It is its own country, just part of the United Kingdom." She processed that for a second and said, "Okay, but they use the same money?" "Yes, same money." She still looked a little unsure, but nodded anyway. Someone once asked me if people in Ireland speak English. I said yes. They asked, "But what about Irish?" I explained that Irish is a separate language, but most people speak English day to day. They said, "So it's like how Mexicans speak Spanish?" I said, "Sure, kind of." They seemed satisfied with that. I didn't have the energy to get into the linguistic history of colonization. A woman in Italy asked why all the signs were in Italian. Not at tourist spots, everywhere. Street signs, shops, menus. She expected more English. I told her she was in Italy. She said, "I know, but everyone travels here." Like that was a reason for a whole country to change its language. The most baffling one was a man who asked if he could use his phone in Europe. I said yes, but he'd need an international plan or local SIM. He said, "No, I mean, does the internet work here?" I stared at him. He was serious. He thought the internet was only American. I told him the World Wide Web was invented by a British guy. He said, "Huh, didn't know that." I worked at a small family restaurant in Florence. We served traditional Tuscan food. Simple, local. The kind of place where the menu hasn't changed in 30 years. An American couple sat down and asked for the Wi-Fi password before they even looked at the menu. I gave it to them. They spent 10 minutes on their phones, then asked if we had burgers. I said no. They asked if we could make one anyway. I said we didn't have the ingredients. The woman sighed and said, "Fine. Do you have chicken fingers?" We did not. We had chicken, but not in finger form. She ordered pasta. Plain. No sauce. Just pasta. With butter. Her husband ordered a steak well done. The chef nearly cried. Another table asked for ranch dressing. We didn't have ranch. They asked what we had instead. I listed our dressings. Olive oil and balsamic. Lemon vinaigrette. They looked disappointed. One of them asked, "Do you have anything normal?" I said olive oil is pretty normal in Italy. They ordered the salad without dressing. Someone once sent back their espresso because it was too small. I explained that's how espresso is served. They said they wanted a normal coffee. I offered an Americano. They said, "What's that?" I explained it's espresso with hot water. They said, "So watered-down coffee?" I said, "Sure." They ordered it, loved it, had no idea they'd just described the drink perfectly. A tourist asked why we didn't have free refills. I explained that's not common in Europe. He said, "But the soda costs like €4. I said yes. He said, "For one glass?" I nodded. He couldn't believe it. Ordered water instead. Then got upset when we charged for that too. "Water should be free," he said. I brought him tap water. Free. He looked at it suspiciously and asked if it was safe to drink. I said yes. He didn't touch it. My co-worker in Spain told me about a group that came in at 6 p.m. and got annoyed that dinner wasn't being served yet. She explained that dinner starts at 9 p.m. They asked what people do until then. She said, "Live their lives?" They ended up ordering appetizers and waiting. At 9 p.m. they were shocked the place was suddenly packed. She said, "This is normal dinner time here." They kept saying how late it was. It was 9 p.m., not midnight, just 9. A guy in Germany asked for ice in his beer. The bartender said no. The guy asked why not. The bartender said, "Because it's beer." The guy said he liked his drinks cold. The bartender said the beer was cold. The guy insisted it wasn't cold enough. The bartender refused. The guy left a bad review online saying the service was rigid and unfriendly. The beer was 4 degrees Celsius. It was cold. Someone asked me once if we had ketchup for their pizza. I said no. They asked if I could check in the back. I said we don't keep ketchup. They said, "Not even for kids?" I said no, not even for kids. They made a face and ate the pizza without it. Later told me it was actually pretty good. I didn't say anything. A woman ordered a cappuccino at 3 p.m. The barista hesitated. She asked if something was wrong. He said, "Cappuccino is a morning drink." She laughed. He didn't. She said, "Wait, you're serious?" He nodded. She ordered it anyway. He made it, but you could tell he was judging her a little bit. Another couple asked why the portions were so small. I explained that European portions are smaller. They said they were still hungry. I suggested ordering another course. They seemed surprised. "You're supposed to order multiple things?" I said yes. That's how meals work here. Appetizer, pasta, main, dessert. They thought it was all expensive until I explained the prices reflect the portion sizes. They ordered more food, left full and happy. A guy sent back his pasta because it was undercooked. I checked with the chef. It was al dente. I explained that to the customer. He said, "I don't know what that means. It's hard." I told him that's how pasta is supposed to be. He insisted it was undercooked. We made it softer. He said it was better. The chef was offended for 3 days. Someone asked if they could get their pizza to go in a box. I said yes. They asked if we had plastic forks. I said no. They asked how they were supposed to eat it. I said with your hands. They looked horrified. With my hands? Yes, it's pizza. They still asked for a fork. I gave them a metal one. They took it with them. Never returned it. We're still missing that fork. A tourist asked why bread came with the meal if it wasn't free. I explained the coperto charge. She said, "So you charge us to sit down?" I said yes. "It's standard." She said that was ridiculous. I shrugged. She paid it, but complained the whole time. The weirdest one was a man who asked if the chicken was American chicken. I asked what he meant. He said, "Like, is it the same kind of chicken we have in the US?" I said it's chicken, from a chicken. He said, "Yeah, but does it taste the same?" I had no idea how to answer that. I said probably. He ordered beef instead. I gave walking tours in London for 3 years. You'd think people doing a history tour would know basic history. You'd be wrong. Someone once asked me if Big Ben was named after Benjamin Franklin. I said no. It's likely named after Benjamin Hall, a British engineer. They looked disappointed. "Oh, I thought it was our Ben Franklin." I said no. Different Ben, different country. They said, but he was in England, right? I said he visited, yes. They said, so maybe it's him. I said it's not. They didn't fully believe me. Another person asked when England became part of America. I stopped walking. Asked them to repeat that. They said, you know, when did England join the United States? I said it didn't. They looked confused. But you speak English? I said yes. Because they colonized America? Not the other way around. They went quiet. I could see them reworking their entire understanding of history. A tourist asked if we were going to see where the Eiffel Tower used to be. I said the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. They said, oh, I thought it moved. I have no idea where they got that idea. I said no, towers don't move. They seemed embarrassed and changed the subject. Someone asked if the UK was in Europe. I said yes, geographically. They said, but didn't Brexit happen? I said yes. They said, so you left Europe. I explained that Brexit was leaving the European Union, not the continent. They said, wait, those are different things? I nodded. They needed a minute to process that. A woman asked how old the Tower of London was. I said about 950 years old. She said, wow, so older than America? I said yes, much older. She said, that's crazy. I didn't know things could be that old. I didn't know how to respond to that. I just moved on with the tour. Another tourist asked if people in Scotland wear kilts every day. I said some do, but it's mostly for special occasions. They seemed let down. So it's just like a costume? I said it's traditional dress, not a costume. They said, same thing though, right? I said, not really. They shrugged and said they hoped to see someone in a kilt anyway. Someone asked me if Ireland and Northern Ireland were the same place. I said no, different countries. They asked why they had similar names then. I explained the history. Partition, independence. The whole thing. They said, that sounds complicated. I said it is. They said, so are they cool with each other now? I said it's complicated. They left it at that. A guy asked if everyone in Europe used the same money. I said no. Some countries use euros. Others don't. He said, why not? I said because they're different countries with different economies. He said, but wouldn't it be easier? I said that's literally what the Eurozone is trying to do. He said, oh, so some do? Yes, some do. He nodded like that made sense, but I'm not sure it did. A tourist asked if the royal family actually lived in Buckingham Palace. I said yes, parts of it. They said, like all the time? I said when they're in London, yes. They said, do they have normal rooms? Like with beds and stuff? I said yes. They're people. They sleep in beds. The tourists seemed to think royalty just stood around in crowns all day. Someone asked why there were so many old buildings in Europe. I said because they're old countries. They said, but don't they ever rebuild? I said some do, but many are preserved. They said it must be expensive. I said yes. History is expensive. They said, we just knock stuff down and build new in the States. I said, I know. A woman asked if people in France really eat snails. I said yes, escargot. She made a face. That's gross. I said it's a delicacy. She said, it's a snail. I said sure, but oysters are weird too if you think about it. She paused. I guess. Then asked if French people think Americans are weird for not eating snails. I said probably. Another person asked if Europe had states like America. I said no. Countries. They asked what the difference was. I explained that countries are fully sovereign. States share a federal government. They said, so like Europe is the big country and France is a state? I said no. France is its own country, with its own government. They said, but you're all close together. I said proximity doesn't make us one country. They said, huh, weird. The strangest one was someone who asked if Big Ben was the original clock. I asked what they meant. They said, like the first clock ever made. I said no. Clocks existed long before that. They seemed surprised. Really? Yes, really. Clocks have been around for centuries. They said, I just thought it was the most famous, so it must be the first. I told them fame and age aren't the same thing. I think my favorite story came from a trip I took to Japan. I wasn't working, just traveling. But I saw an American couple at a temple in Kyoto. They walked right into the main hall with their shoes on. A monk very politely stopped them, gestured to their feet. They looked down, looked at each other. The woman said, "Oh, are we supposed to take them off?" The monk nodded. They stepped back outside, took off their shoes, and apologized. The monk smiled and bowed. No big deal. They didn't know. But what stuck with me was what the woman said as they walked away. I didn't realize we were supposed to do that. Nobody told us. And I thought, nobody has to tell you. You're in someone else's country, at their sacred space. You watch what others do. You follow along. You adapt. That's the thing with a lot of these stories. Nobody's trying to be disrespectful. They're just surprised the world doesn't work like it does back home. And I get it. Traveling is disorienting. Everything is different. Language, customs, food, money, even plugs don't fit the same way. But the funniest moments happen when people forget they're the guests, when they expect the world to adjust to them instead of the other way around. Like the guy who got mad that the ATM gave him euros instead of dollars. Or the woman who asked why everyone in Portugal spoke Portuguese. Or the tourist who genuinely believed Big Ben chimed in American Eastern Time. These stories aren't meant to make anyone feel bad. They're just reminders that the world is bigger than any one country. That when you travel, you're stepping into someone else's normal. And their normal might look weird to you. But your normal probably looks just as weird to them. I'll never forget the man in Germany who tried to pay with a dollar bill and seemed genuinely shocked when the cashier said no. He held it up and said, "But it's money." The cashier said, "Not here." He looked at the bill, looked at the cashier, and said, I guess I didn't think about that." And honestly, that's the lesson. Think about it. You're not home. The rules are different. The language is different. The money is different. And that's okay. That's what makes traveling worth it. But maybe, just maybe, double-check which side of the road you're supposed to drive on. And know that 14 uur means 2 p.m. And for the love of everything, turn off airplane mode when you land. Trust me, these stories never stop coming. Every day, someone walks into a hotel lobby or train station or restaurant and accidentally proves they forgot they're the tourist. And honestly, we're all that person sometimes. The trick is realizing it before you ask someone to hold a train so you can get coffee. Because they won't. Trains don't wait. Not even for nice tourists. If you value context over cliches and want more of these stories that connect culture, travel, and perspective, this is where you'll find them.